Hello and welcome to part 2 of this workbench build. In part 1 we built the leg assemblies, which you can see here, and today we're going to be building the aprons and getting this thing standing on 4 legs. If you missed part 1, I'll put a card at the top so you can go straight to it, but if not, let's get into it. I'm making this workbench out of cheap 5x2s, but I need my apron to be 11 inches by 2 inches, so the first thing I've got to do is to join some of these 5x2s together. There's a couple of ways to do this, so I thought I'd try 2 and then tell you which one I think is the best. The first way I wanted to try aligning the boards is with dowels. Now in order to do that, you can buy a cheap doweling jig off Amazon. However, I decided to make one out of scrap I had lying around. It's not pretty, but let's see if it gets the job done. Now as you can see, I've made a small hole in the top, which just essentially allows me to reference the lines that I'm going to draw on the workpiece, just to make sure that I'm lining everything up nicely. And then I'm just transposing some lines onto the actual jig, just so I can line everything up. And then you just need to drill your guide hole. Now obviously this thing will degrade over time. This is very much a one and done jig. We're not going to be keeping this. Once I've aligned the boards, I can then just make some marks where I want the jig to sit. And drill the holes. And then once we've got our holes in place, we can just slot in the dowels and then put the two pieces together. Now unfortunately, I forgot to press record once I glued things up, but you have to trust me, it went together fine. So for the second apron, I wanted to try a totally different approach. On the first one, I ran the 5x2s through the table saw to get a nice clean edge to glue together, taking off the rounding that you get in a 5x2. On the second one, I just ran them through the planer, and that worked wonders in getting a really nice consistent edge for me to glue up. This thing is pretty noisy and I'm pretty sure I ruined one of my neighbour's barbecues, but this is for YouTube, it's important. No doweling jig this time. For this one we're going to try a different alignment method as well. Is it a Festool domino? Maybe. No, it's a router. The only thing I really want to get here is just to make sure that when I glue the boards together we get a nice consistent face all the way across, so it just minimises the amount of planing that I'm going to have to do. I bought a cheap biscuiting bit off Amazon and whacked it in the router, and then just did 5 points along the 2.4 metre board just to get things nice and aligned. And then once we've got our grooves cut, it's just time to glue up. I am going to have to use a similar approach when I laminate the boards together to make the top. Now I'm definitely going to use the router approach. It's just far easier, far more consistent, and actually the finished result was that these boards were far more aligned than the doweling approach, so this would be the method I'm going to use and I would recommend you doing the same. So if there's any mathematicians watching, you'll have realised that gluing two 5x2s together will not give you an 11-inch apron. So I then had to run another 5x2 through the table saw, make some shorter pieces to then add on to get me to the 11 inches that I needed. I've said it before, but as soon as there's glue involved, something will go wrong. And you get this mild panic where you're trying to get things glued up quickly, aligned nicely, and there's always going to be something that goes wrong. Wonder what goes wrong this time. Well, there's actually two things that went wrong. First thing was I was over squeezing that bottle and the cap popped off. Luckily just off camera, but I lost about half my glue onto the floor, so that's going to be fun to explain to the missus later. And then for some reason these two boards would not align. I didn't realise that biscuit hadn't found the slot and was floating across the top of the wood. But being the fine woodworker that I am, just sort of leant on it, bashed it, tried to squeeze it, brute force it. Still not noticed. Oh yeah. Now this bit's pretty satisfying as we start to see the workbench look a little bit like a workbench. And I start to realise how big this thing is. It's 8 foot long and I have a tiny workshop, so it's going to be a key feature within this workshop. Hi, Chip. So any good Nicholson has a nice big chamfer on the edge. Doesn't really serve any purpose, but it just looks good, so we're going to add this on with just a 45 degree using a carpenter square. Now when the glue's dry, this thing shouldn't really need screws, but I am going to add some pilot holes for screws just to make sure that this thing is as sturdy as possible and it pulls the joint together as it glues up. And once again my glue anxiety kicks in as we try and get everything glued up before the glue goes off. This thing doesn't go off particularly fast, but after the experience I've had earlier today, I'm on edge. Once the first apron was on, the second one went on much easier. I'm not just whacking it on, I do have some marks that I'm referencing on the inside of the wood, just to make sure that everything's in alignment when I glue it up. After I got the two aprons on, this is where I started throwing my weight into it and really shoving this thing around, and this thing is sturdy. I think having the legs splayed out at 20 degrees really helps with the racking forces, but this thing is not going anywhere, so it's only going to get more strong from this point, so really happy with how things are looking so far. So the aprons are on and this thing is standing up on its own, and that makes the end of part 2 of this build. Don't forget to subscribe to see part 3 of this build where I put together the top and start thinking about work holding. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.